Sometimes the loneliest people have the biggest hearts. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for exactly what you need. In Montana Territory, 1887, Boone Cutter was a giant of a man who scared everyone in town. Standing 7 feet tall with hands like shovels, people whispered he'd killed a grizzly bear with his bare hands. When Boone posted a simple notice seeking a wife, the whole town laughed. No woman would ever answer such a call. But Clara Lynn Porter, a quiet baker's assistant with nothing left to lose, didn't laugh when she read those words. Something in that honest request spoke to her heart. What happens when the town's most feared man meets the one woman brave enough to see past his frightening appearance? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clara Lynn Porter had been kneading dough since before dawn, her capable hands working the familiar rhythm that had sustained her through 3 years of solitude. The bakery's warmth provided refuge from the October chill that swept through Millbrook, Montana Territory, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and the promise of an early winter. At 24, Clara possessed the quiet grace of someone who had learned to find contentment in simple tasks, her auburn hair pinned neatly beneath a flour-dusted apron that had once belonged to her mother. The recipe book lay open beside her workspace, its pages yellowed with age and splattered with the evidence of countless meals prepared with love. Clara's mother had filled those pages with more than ingredients and instructions. She had written notes in the margins, small observations about life and cooking that read like gentle advice from beyond the grave. A pinch of patience makes any bread rise sweeter. Read one such note, written in her mother's careful script beside a recipe for Sunday loaves. Clara had been orphaned at 19 when fever took both her parents within a week of each other. The small farm they'd worked had been sold to pay debts, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back, her mother's recipe book, and a fierce determination to survive with dignity. Old Henrik Jorgensen, the Danish baker, who owned the only bakery in Millbrook, had taken pity on her situation and offered her work in exchange for a small room above the shop and meals. It wasn't much, but it was honest work, and Clara had learned to find satisfaction in the simple act of feeding others. The bakery sat on Main Street, its windows offering a clear view of the town's daily rhythms. Clara had watched seasons change from behind that glass, observing the lives of others while remaining carefully on the periphery. She saw the young mothers with their children, the couples walking arm in arm after church, the families gathering for celebrations she was never invited to join. It wasn't self-pity that filled her heart. During these observations, Clara had little patience for such indulgences, but rather a quiet acknowledgement of her place in the world's order. Millbrook wasn't a large town, but it buzzed with the energy of a community that had grown prosperous from cattle ranching and the railroad that passed through twice weekly. The people were generally kind, if somewhat reserved toward outsiders, and Clara had earned their respect through her reliability and the quality of her bread. She spoke little but listened much, learning the intricate web of relationships that bound the town together. This morning, like every morning, Clara would finish her baking, arrange the loaves and pastries in the display case, and sweep the floors before Henrik arrived to open the shop. The routine provided structure to her days, a dependable pattern that asked nothing of her beyond competence and consistency. She had grown comfortable with this life, even if it held little promise of change or excitement. The bell above the door chimed as Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, entered with her usual purposeful stride. "Good morning, Clara," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "I'll need 24 of your dinner rolls for the church social this Saturday." "Of course, Mrs. Henderson," Clara replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "Should I prepare them with the herb mixture you preferred last time?" "Yes, that would be perfect." Mrs. Henderson paused, studying Clara with the calculating gaze she reserved for matters of town business. "You know, dear, you really should consider attending the social yourself. There are several young men in town who would benefit from meeting a woman of your practical nature." Clara managed a polite smile. I appreciate the thought, but I'm quite content with my current situation. This wasn't entirely true, but Clara had learned that expressions of contentment were easier for others to accept than honest admissions of loneliness. The truth was more complex than she cared to examine too closely. At 24, she was well past the age when most women married, and her circumstances made her an unlikely candidate for courtship. She had no dowry, no family connections, and no prospects beyond her skills with flour and yeast. After Mrs. Henderson left, Clara returned to her work, but something had shifted in her morning routine. Perhaps it was the mention of the social, or the way the autumn light slanted through the windows, but she found herself thinking about the future with uncommon clarity. This life, comfortable as it was, stretched ahead of her like a well-worn path, predictable, safe, and ultimately leading nowhere she hadn't already been. The morning passed in its usual rhythm. Farmers stopped by for their daily bread, mothers purchased sweet rolls for their children, and the town's bachelors made their carefully casual visits, ostensibly for pastries, but clearly hoping for conversation with the quiet baker's assistant. Clara treated them all with the same courteous efficiency, neither encouraging nor discouraging their attention. It was just after noon when she decided to take her lunch break and walk to the general store for supplies. The October air was crisp against her face as she stepped outside, and she took a moment to appreciate the simple pleasure of sunshine after hours in the bakery's warmth. Main Street bustled with the usual midday activity, horses tied to hitching posts, children playing between the buildings, and groups of men gathered around the town bulletin board. Clara normally paid little attention to the bulletin board, which typically displayed notices about lost livestock, upcoming church services, and advertisements for patent medicines. Today, however, something about the crowd's behavior caught her attention. The men weren't engaged in their usual quiet discussion of weather and cattle prices. Instead, they were laughing, not the comfortable laughter of shared jokes, but the sharp, mocking laughter that accompanied someone else's misfortune. Curiosity overcame her usual reticence, and Clara approached the group. The men were so absorbed in their amusement that they didn't notice her arrival. She could see over their shoulders to the bulletin board, where a new notice had been posted alongside the familiar announcements. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, written in the measured strokes of someone unaccustomed to putting personal thoughts on paper. The message was simple, almost stark in its directness. Seeking a wife. I am Boone Cutter of the Triple C Ranch, 5 miles north of town. I offer a good house, fertile land, and peaceful company. I am not a man of many words, but I am honest and hard-working. If you are a woman of similar character who seeks a quiet life, please visit my ranch. I will treat you with respect and provide well for your needs. Clara read the notice twice, her heart beating with an odd combination of sympathy and intrigue. She had heard of Boone Cutter. Of course, everyone in Millbrook had heard the stories. He was the giant who lived alone on the ranch north of town, the man whose very presence seemed to unsettle horses and silence conversations. The tales varied depending on who told them, but certain details remained constant: his enormous size, his fearsome strength, and his preference for solitude. "Can you imagine?" one of the men was saying, his voice thick with amusement. "That monster actually thinks some woman would want to marry him." "Maybe, if he offered to pay her," another suggested, prompting fresh laughter from the group. "I heard he killed a man in Denver just by looking at him wrong," a third voice added. "What woman would want to wake up next to that every morning?" Clara felt a flush of anger rise in her cheeks. These men knew nothing about Boone Cutter beyond rumors and speculation, yet they felt qualified to judge his worth as a potential husband. She had lived long enough to understand that appearances could be deceiving, and that loneliness was a burden that fell on good and bad people alike. As she stood there, reading the notice for a third time, Clara felt something stir within her that she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of possibility. Not romantic possibility, necessarily, but something more fundamental. Here was a man who had found the courage to ask for what he wanted, despite knowing he would face mockery and rejection. Here was someone who, like herself, seemed to exist on the margins of the community's social fabric. The men's laughter continued, but Clara no longer heard it. She was thinking about her mother's recipe book, about the small room above the bakery, about the years stretching ahead with their predictable sameness. She was thinking about courage and kindness, about the difference between being alone and being lonely. When she finally turned away from the bulletin board, Clara's mind was made up. She would visit Boone Cutter's ranch, not because she was desperate for marriage, but because something in his simple, honest request had touched a part of her heart she had thought permanently closed. Perhaps they could offer each other something more valuable than romance. Perhaps they could offer each other understanding. The afternoon's work passed in a blur of activity, but Clara's thoughts remained focused on the decision she had made. She would go tomorrow, after the bakery closed. She would take her mother's recipe book not as a dowry, but as a symbol of the life she was ready to build. And she would approach Boone Cutter not as a woman seeking rescue, but as an equal seeking partnership. That evening, as she prepared for bed in her small room above the bakery, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in years: anticipation for tomorrow. Whatever happened at the Triple C Ranch, it would be a step towards something new, something chosen rather than simply accepted. For the first time in a long time, Clara Lynn Porter was ready to write her own story. The journey to the Triple C Ranch took Clara through countryside she had never seen before, despite living in Millbrook for 3 years. The trail north wound through rolling hills, dotted with aspens whose leaves had turned brilliant gold in the autumn air. Her borrowed mare, a gentle sorrel named Daisy, that Henrik had insisted she take, picked her way carefully along the well-worn path that suggested regular use, despite Boone Cutter's reputation for isolation. Clara had left town just after the bakery closed, carrying only a small bundle containing her mother's recipe book, a change of clothes, and enough food for the journey. She had told Henrik she was visiting a sick friend in the next valley, small deception that felt necessary to avoid the well-meaning interference she was sure would follow if anyone knew her true destination. The ranch buildings came into view as the trail crested a low hill, and Clara felt her breath catch at the sight. Whatever she had expected, it wasn't this. The Triple C was clearly prosperous, with a substantial 2-story house painted white with green shutters, a massive barn that looked recently repaired, and several outbuildings arranged in neat order around a central yard. Smoke rose from the house's chimney, and she could see cattle grazing in the distance, their forms dark against the golden grass. Everything about the place spoke of careful maintenance and pride in ownership. The fences were straight and strong, the yard was free of debris, and even the hen house looked freshly whitewashed. This wasn't the lair of a monster. As the town gossips suggested, it was the home of a man who took seriously his responsibilities as a landowner. Clara dismounted near the front porch, her legs unsteady after the long ride. The house was larger than she had imagined, with wide windows that suggested someone who valued light and space. A rocking chair sat on the porch, positioned to catch the morning sun, and she noticed that the boards beneath it were worn smooth, as if someone spent considerable time there. Before she could approach the door, it opened, and Clara got her first glimpse of Boone Cutter. The stories hadn't exaggerated his size. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to span the entire doorway. His hair was dark and thick, hanging to his collar, and his beard was neatly trimmed, despite its fullness. But it was his eyes that surprised her. Most they were a warm brown, gentle and cautious, not the cold, predatory gaze she had expected based on the town's descriptions. He wore simple clothes-dark pants, a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and a leather vest that emphasized the breadth of his chest. His hands, visible as he gripped the doorframe, were indeed large, but they moved with a careful precision that spoke of someone accustomed to controlling his strength. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Clara had prepared several opening remarks during her ride, but faced with the reality of Boone Cutter's presence, she found herself at a loss for words. He seemed equally uncertain, his eyes moving from her face to the horse and back again, as if trying to determine whether she was real or some elaborate joke. "Mr. Cutter," she finally said, her voice steadier than she felt, I'm Clara Porter. I came about your notice. His eyebrows rose slightly, and she saw something that might have been surprise cross his features. You came about. He paused, clearing his throat. When he spoke again, his voice was indeed deep, but it carried none of the menace the townspeople attributed to it. You came about the notice. Yes, sir. I hope I'm not intruding. No, he said quickly, then seemed to catch himself. I mean, no, you're not intruding. He gestured vaguely, and Clara realized he was genuinely flustered by her presence. I didn't expect anyone to come. May I ask why you posted it then? The question seemed to catch him off guard. He was quiet for so long that Clara began to wonder if he would answer at all. Finally, he stepped back from the doorway and gestured for her to enter. Would you like some coffee? It's been a long ride from town. Clara accepted the invitation, leading Daisy to a hitching post near the porch before following Boone inside. The interior of the house was as surprising as the exterior had been. The main room was spacious and clean, with comfortable furniture arranged around a stone fireplace. Books lined one wall, more books than Clara had expected to find in the home of a man rumored to be barely civilized. The kitchen was visible through an open doorway, and she caught glimpses of well-maintained pots and pans hanging from hooks. What struck her most was the silence. Not the oppressive silence of an empty house, but the peaceful quiet of a home where someone had learned to live contentedly alone. It was a silence she recognized, having cultivated it herself in the small room above the bakery. Boone moved to the kitchen with surprising grace for such a large man, his movements economical and careful. Clara could hear him working the sound of a coffee pot being filled, the scrape of a chair being moved. She used the time to study her surroundings more carefully. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace, she noticed something that made her heart skip. Among the few personal items displayed, there was a small wooden horse, carved with exquisite detail. The craftsmanship was remarkable. Every line of the horse's body was perfectly proportioned, its mane flowing as if caught by an invisible wind. The wood had been polished to a warm glow, and Clara could see the care that had gone into its creation. "You made this?" she said when Boone returned with 2 cups of coffee. He followed her gaze to the wooden horse, and she saw color rise in his cheeks. "It's nothing special, just something to do with my hands during the long evenings." "It's beautiful," Clara said, meaning it. "You have real skill." Boone set the coffee cups on a small table and gestured for her to sit. "I've been carving since I was a boy. My father taught me. He said it was good for a man to create something, not just work the land." This was the longest speech Clara had heard from him, and she sensed an opening. "Tell me about your father." "He built this ranch from nothing," Boone said, settling into a chair that seemed almost too small for his frame. "Came out here in '65, right after the war. Said he wanted to find someplace quiet, where a man could live in peace." He paused, sipping his coffee. "He was a good man. Quiet, like me, but good." "And your mother?" "She died when I was 12. Fever." The words were matter of fact, but Clara heard the old pain beneath them. "After that, it was just me and my father, until he passed 5 years ago." Clara felt a familiar pang of sympathy. They had that in common, at least the experience of loss, of learning to build a life from the fragments left behind. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you." He looked at her with those gentle brown eyes. "What about you? The notice said you were looking for a quiet life." It was Clara's turn to hesitate. How could she explain the complexity of her motivations to this man she had just met? How could she tell him that she had come not because she was desperate for marriage, but because something in his simple request had touched her heart? "I work at the bakery in town," she said finally. "I've been there for 3 years, since my parents died. It's honest work, and I'm grateful for it, but—" She paused, searching for the right words. "I suppose I'm looking for something more than just survival." Boone nodded slowly. "I understand that feeling." "Do you? Is that why you posted the notice?" He was quiet for a moment, staring into his coffee cup. "This place is beautiful," he said finally. "I've got good land, healthy cattle, a house that stays warm in winter and cool in summer. I've got more than most men could ask for." He looked up at her. But it's quiet, maybe too quiet. Clara felt something shift in her chest. Here was honesty, simple and unadorned. No grand declarations or romantic promises, just a man admitting that prosperity without companionship felt incomplete. "The people in town," she began. "I know what they say about me," Boone interrupted gently. "Some of it's true. I'm not a small man, and I'm not much for conversation. I've had to defend myself a few times over the years, and I suppose word gets around." He met her eyes. "But I've never hurt anyone who didn't hurt me first. I'm not the monster they make me out to be." "I didn't think you were," Clara said. "If I had, I wouldn't have come." "Why did you come?" The question hung in the air between them. Clara could have given him any number of practical answers. She was alone, she had few prospects, she was curious about the ranch. All of these would have been true, but they wouldn't have been the whole truth. "Because you asked honestly," she said finally. "In your notice, you didn't try to make yourself sound like something you're not. You didn't promise romance or adventure. You just asked for what you wanted: peaceful company." She paused. "I respect that kind of honesty." Boone's expression grew thoughtful. "And is that what you want? Peaceful company?" "I think it might be," Clara said. "I've been alone for a long time, Mr. Cutter. I've learned to be self-sufficient, to find satisfaction in simple work. But I've also learned that sharing a life with someone even quietly might be better than living it alone." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Clara found herself studying Boone's face, noting the intelligence in his eyes, the careful way he held himself, as if he was constantly aware of his size and its potential to intimidate. This wasn't the crude giant of town gossip, but a man who had learned to live thoughtfully, even if he lived alone. "I should probably head back to town before dark," Clara said eventually, though she found herself reluctant to leave. "Of course," Boone said, rising from his chair. "I'll help you with your horse." As they walked outside together, Clara felt a strange sense of disappointment. The afternoon had been pleasant, even enlightening, but she wasn't sure what would come next. Would he ask her to return? Would he visit her in town? The uncertainty was more unsettling than she had expected. "Miss Porter," Boone said, as she prepared to mount Daisy. "Would you—" He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "Would you consider coming back? Perhaps this weekend? I could show you more of the ranch, if you're interested." Clara felt a smile tug at the corners of her mouth. "I'd like that, Mr. Cutter. I'd like that very much." "Boone," he said quietly. "You can call me Boone." "Clara," she replied. "And yes, Boone, I'll come back this weekend." As she rode away from the Triple C Ranch, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in years: anticipation for the future. Whatever developed between her and Boone Cutter, it would be built on honesty and mutual respect. In a world that often seemed harsh and unpredictable, that felt like a foundation worth building on. The wooden horse remained in her thoughts during the ride back to town, a symbol of the gentle artistry that existed alongside Boone's impressive strength. Perhaps, she thought, there was more to everyone than what showed on the surface. Perhaps it was time she started looking deeper. Clara returned to the Triple C Ranch the following Saturday, this time carrying a small basket containing fresh bread and butter she had prepared that morning. The ride felt shorter than before, familiar now that she knew the path and had something to look forward to at its end. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the promise of winter, but Clara felt warmer than she had in months. Boone was waiting for her on the porch, and she noticed he had taken care with his appearance. His beard was freshly trimmed, his shirt was clean and pressed, and his boots had been polished to a shine. The sight of his careful preparations touched her more than elaborate gifts might have. Here was a man who understood that small courtesies mattered, even in the isolated world of a Montana ranch. "Clara," he said, rising from the rocking chair as she approached. "I'm glad you came back." "I brought something for you," she said, offering the basket. "Fresh bread and some of my mother's honey butter." Boone's eyes lit up as he accepted the basket, and Clara caught a glimpse of the boy he must have been before life and circumstance had made him so carefully guarded. "That's very kind of you." I can't remember the last time someone brought me fresh bread. When did you last have company? Clara asked as they walked toward the house. Not counting the occasional visit from the veterinarian or the men who come to buy cattle, it's been more than a year, Boone admitted. I'm not much for socializing in town, and most folks seem to prefer it that way. Clara felt a pang of sadness at his matter-of-fact tone. Their loss, she said simply. The day was mild enough that they could sit on the porch, and Boone had positioned 2 chairs to catch the afternoon sun. Clara settled into one, while he went inside to fetch coffee and plates for the bread. She used the time to observe the ranch with more attention than she had paid during her first visit. The property was indeed impressive. The pastures stretched as far as she could see, dotted with cattle that looked healthy and well tended. The barn was massive, large enough to house dozens of animals during the harsh Montana winters. Everything spoke of careful planning and hard work, of a man who took pride in his responsibilities. When Boone returned with a tray, Clara noticed his movements were more relaxed than they had been during her first visit. He seemed to have accepted her presence as genuine rather than temporary, and she found herself appreciating the quiet confidence with which he handled the simple task of serving coffee. "Tell me about the ranch," she said as they shared the bread. "How many cattle do you run?" "About 300 head, Boone said, settling into his chair. "I sell steers to the railroad buyers each fall, keep the best heifers for breeding. It's good land for cattle, plenty of grass and water, shelter from the worst weather. Do you manage it all yourself?" "Mostly. I hire extra hands during roundup and branding, but for the day-to-day work it's just me." He paused, studying her face. "It's a lot of work for one person, but I'm used to it." Clara heard the unspoken question in his words. Was she prepared for the reality of ranch life? Did she understand what she would be taking on if she chose to stay? "I'm not afraid of hard work," she said quietly. "I've been supporting myself since I was 19. I know what it means to get up before dawn and work until dark." "Baking bread is different from ranch work," Boone said, not unkindly. "Yes, it is," Clara agreed. "But I grew up on a farm. I know how to milk cows, tend chickens, preserve food for winter. I'm not some delicate town lady who would faint at the sight of hard labor." Boone smiled, the first genuine, unreserved smile she had seen from him. "I didn't think you were. You wouldn't have come here if you were." After they finished eating, Boone offered to show her around the property. They walked first to the barn, where Clara marveled at the neat stalls and the obvious care that had gone into maintaining the building. The smell of hay and leather was comforting, familiar from her childhood. "This is Lady," Boone said, stopping at a stall that held a beautiful chestnut mare. "She's getting old, but she's still the smartest horse I've ever owned." Clara extended her hand, letting the mare sniff her fingers before stroking her neck. "She's lovely. How long have you had her?" 15 years. My father bought her as a filly." Boone's voice carried a note of affection that Clara hadn't heard before. "She's the one who taught me that patience works better than force when you're dealing with any living creature." They continued their tour, visiting the hen house where a dozen chickens pecked contentedly in the dirt, the smokehouse where Boone cured his own meat, and the garden plot where he grew vegetables for his own table. Everything was practical and well-maintained, but Clara began to notice small details that spoke to a different side of Boone's character. The hen house had small windows positioned to catch the morning light, and the roosts were built with more care than strictly necessary. The garden was laid out not just for efficiency but for beauty, with neat rows that formed pleasing patterns. Near the house, she spotted a small flower bed where someone had planted bulbs that would bloom in spring. "You planted flowers," she said, stopping to examine the carefully tended soil. Boone's face reddened slightly. "My mother always said a home should have something beautiful that serves no purpose except to make people smile. After she died, my father kept up her flower beds. When he passed, He shrugged, embarrassed. "I suppose I kept up the tradition." Clara felt her heart soften. Here was a man who, despite his isolation and the world's harsh judgment, had maintained a connection to beauty and gentle memory. "What kind of flowers?" "Daffodils, mostly. Some tulips. They're hardy enough to survive the winters here." He paused. "There's a patch of wildflowers behind the house that my mother started. I've been adding to it over the years." "I'd like to see it," Clara said. The wildflower patch was larger than she had expected, a carefully tended space where native plants had been encouraged to grow in natural-looking clusters. Even now, in late autumn, she could see the dried stalks of what must have been a spectacular display during the summer months. "It's beautiful," she said, meaning it. "You've created something wonderful here." "It's not much," Boone said, but Clara could hear the pleasure in his voice. As they walked back toward the house, Clara found herself imagining what it would be like to live here, to wake each morning to the sight of mountains and sky instead of the narrow view from her window above the bakery. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. "Boone," she said as they reached the porch, "what exactly are you looking for in a wife?" He was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "Someone who could be content with this life," he said finally. "Someone who wouldn't need constant entertainment or social gatherings to be happy. Someone who could find satisfaction in simple things, good food, comfortable shelter, honest work. And companionship." "Yes," he said softly, "companionship. Someone to share the quiet moments with. Someone who wouldn't be afraid of me." Clara felt a flutter of something she couldn't quite name. "I'm not afraid of you, Boone." "I know," he said, meeting her eyes. "That's why I hoped you'd come back." They spent the rest of the afternoon talking, sharing stories about their childhoods, their work, their dreams for the future. Clara found herself impressed by Boone's thoughtfulness, his dry sense of humor, and the gentle way he spoke about the animals in his care. He wasn't the crude giant of town gossip, but a man who had learned to find meaning in solitude and work. As the sun began to set, Clara knew she needed to return to town. The ride back in darkness would be challenging, and she didn't want to worry Henrik, who had grown protective of her welfare. "I should go," she said reluctantly. "Of course." Boone rose from his chair, and Clara noticed he had built something while they talked. On the small table beside them sat a wooden porch swing, its chains carefully measured and ready for hanging. "What's this?" Clara asked, running her hand along the smooth wood. "I thought," Boone began, then stopped, looking uncertain. "I thought if you came back, you might like to have a comfortable place to sit. The chairs are fine, but a swing might be nicer for talking." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. The swing was beautiful, built with the same careful craftsmanship as the wooden horse she had admired. More than that, it represented Boone's hope that she would return, that they might build something together. "It's perfect," she said. "When will you hang it?" "Tomorrow, if you'd like. You could come back next Saturday and try it out." Clara smiled. "I'd like that very much." As she rode back to town, Clara's mind was full of images from the day, the careful way Boone had served coffee, the pride in his voice as he showed her around the ranch, the gentle attention he paid to his animals. Most of all, she thought about the porch swing, a symbol of his growing trust in her presence. For the first time in years, Clara felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The future, which had seemed so fixed and predictable just a week ago, now felt full of possibility. Whatever came next, she was ready to face it with the quiet, thoughtful man who had surprised her with his kindness and his hope. Clara's third visit to the Triple C Ranch brought with it a shift in the seasons and in her relationship with Boone. The first snow had fallen during the week, dusting the mountains with white and reminding everyone that winter was approaching. She had packed warmer clothes and brought along her mother's recipe for beef stew, thinking that Boone might appreciate a hearty meal as the weather turned cold. The porch swing was hanging when she arrived, positioned perfectly to catch the afternoon sun while providing a view of the entire valley. Boone was waiting for her, and she noticed he had cleared a path through the light snow from the hitching post to the porch. "How do you like it?" he asked, gesturing toward the swing. "It's perfect," Clara said, settling onto the smooth wooden seat. The swing moved gently under her weight, and she could already imagine spending many peaceful hours here. "You do beautiful work, Boone." "Thank you." He joined her on the swing, careful to leave appropriate space between them. "I've been looking forward to this all week." The admission touched Clara more than elaborate compliments might have. Boone's honesty was becoming one of the things she valued most about him. He didn't engage in the flowery courtship rituals she had observed in town, but his straightforward expressions of pleasure in her company felt more genuine than any practiced charm. "I brought ingredients for stew," Clara said. "I thought you might appreciate something warming on a day like this." "You didn't have to do that," Boone said, but his eyes lit up with genuine pleasure. "Though I admit I've been living mostly on bacon and beans since the weather turned." "Well, then it's a good thing I came prepared to cook for you." They moved inside, and Clara was struck again by the comfortable warmth of Boone's home. He had built up the fire in the hearth, and the main room glowed with golden light. She noticed new details: this time a stack of books on the table beside his chair, a half-finished carving project on the mantelpiece, and what looked like a woman's shawl draped over the back of a chair near the fire. "That was my mother's," Boone said, following her gaze. "I thought you might be cold during your visits." The thoughtfulness of the gesture made Clara's throat tighten with emotion. "That's very kind of you." In the kitchen, Clara found that Boone had stocked supplies with obvious care. The pantry held not just the bachelor staples she had expected, but ingredients that suggested he had been thinking about her visits: flour for baking, spices for seasoning, and even a small jar of honey that he must have purchased specially. "You've been planning ahead," she observed. "I hoped you'd want to cook here sometimes," Boone admitted. "I thought if you had what you needed, you might—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I thought it might feel more like home." Clara felt her heart skip. The word home hung in the air between them, carrying implications neither of them was quite ready to address directly. But the sentiment behind it was clear. Boone was hoping she would stay, hoping they could build something lasting together. As Clara prepared the stew, Boone moved around the kitchen with surprising grace, anticipating her needs and staying out of her way. She found herself appreciating the quiet efficiency of their partnership, the way they could work together without constant conversation or direction. "Tell me about your plans for the winter," Clara said as she stirred the pot. "How do you manage the ranch when the weather gets bad?" "The cattle are hardy," Boone said, leaning against the counter. "I move them to the lower pastures where there's more shelter. The barn holds enough hay to feed them through the worst storms. Mostly, winter is about maintenance, repairing equipment, planning for spring." "And you do all this alone?" "I have been," Boone said quietly. "But I've been wondering lately if that's the best way." Clara understood the question in his words. "What would change if you had help?" "I could run more cattle, maybe start a horse breeding program. Lady's getting old, but she's got good bloodlines. With the right stallion, I could breed horses that would be valuable to other ranchers." He paused. "But mostly, I think the work would be more satisfying if it was shared." "What about the isolation? Are you concerned about how a wife would handle being so far from town?" Boone was quiet for a moment. "I've thought about that," he said finally. "I know it's not an easy life for a woman, but I've also noticed that you don't seem to need constant social interaction to be content." "No," Clara agreed. "I've never been one for parties or social gatherings. I find more peace in quiet activities, reading, cooking, working with my hands." "Would you miss the bakery?" Clara considered the question seriously. "I'd miss the satisfaction of feeding people, of creating something useful, but I wouldn't miss the early mornings or the repetitive work. If I could find ways to be useful here, to contribute to something larger than myself, I think I'd be happier than I've been in years." "There's plenty of work here," Boone said. "The garden could be expanded, the chickens would benefit from more attention, and there's always food to preserve and prepare. But it would be different from what you're used to." "Different isn't necessarily bad," Clara said. "Sometimes different is exactly what we need." They ate the stew in comfortable silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Clara found herself imagining what it would be like to prepare meals in this kitchen regularly, to tend the garden she had seen, to work alongside Boone in the daily tasks of ranch management. The idea was both thrilling and daunting. After dinner, they returned to the porch swing despite the cold air. Boone had brought wool blankets, and they sat closer together than they had before, sharing warmth and watching the snow fall in the lamplight. "Clara," Boone said quietly, "I want to be honest with you about something." "What is it?" "I've been thinking about asking you to marry me," he said, his voice steady but careful. "But I want to make sure you understand what that would mean." Clara's heart began to race, but she kept her voice calm. "Tell me." "It would mean living here year-round, through winters that can be harsh and isolating. It would mean sharing the work and the responsibilities, but also the hardships. It would mean being married to a man who doesn't have many friends, who isn't welcome in polite society." "And what would it mean for you?" Clara asked. "It would mean having someone to share this life with," Boone said simply. "Someone to talk to in the evenings, someone to work alongside, someone to plan for the future with. It would mean not being alone anymore." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "That sounds like exactly what I want too." "Does it?" Boone turned to face her, his expression earnest. "Because I need you to be sure, Clara. I've been alone for so long that I've learned to be content with solitude. But if you came here and then decided you couldn't stay, I don't think I could go back to being content with being alone." The vulnerability in his voice made Clara's chest ache. "I'm not going anywhere, Boone. I've been thinking about this too, and I believe we could build something good together." "You do?" "I do." Clara reached for his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of years of hard work, the strength that he held so carefully in check. "I think we understand each other in ways that matter. We both know what it's like to be alone, to work hard, to find satisfaction in simple things. We both want companionship more than passion, partnership more than romance." "I'm not saying there couldn't be more than that," Boone said carefully. "In time, if we both—" "I know," Clara said softly, "but I appreciate that you're not making promises you can't keep. I appreciate your honesty about what you can offer." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the snow fall and listening to the quiet sounds of the ranch settling for the night. Clara found herself imagining waking up to this view every morning, sharing coffee with Boone on the porch swing, working together to build something lasting. "I should probably head back," she said eventually. "The snow is getting heavier." "Stay," Boone said suddenly, then colored at his own boldness. "I mean, you could stay in my mother's room. It's too dangerous to ride back in this weather." Clara considered the offer. It would be improper by town standards, but they were well past worrying about conventional propriety. "If you're sure it wouldn't be inappropriate." "I trust you," Boone said simply. "And I trust myself." That night, Clara slept in a room that still held traces of its former occupanta faded quilt, a brush and mirror set on the dresser, a small Bible on the nightstand. She felt a strange sense of continuity, as if she was taking her place in a story that had begun long before her arrival. The next morning, she woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Boone had been up early, tending to the animals and preparing breakfast. They ate together as the sun rose over the snow-covered valley, and Clara felt a deep sense of rightness about the scene. "I could get used to this," she said. "I hope you do," Boone replied. "I hope you do." As Clara prepared to leave that afternoon, she knew that her next visit would be different. They had crossed some invisible line during their conversation on the porch swing, moving from tentative courtship to genuine partnership. The future, which had seemed so uncertain just a few weeks ago, now felt full of promise. She had found her place, and it was here, with this gentle giant who had enough courage to ask for what he wanted and enough patience to wait for the right answer. Together, they would build something that neither could have created alone, a life of quiet contentment, shared purpose, and growing love. The first real test of their growing partnership came 3 weeks later, when Clara arrived at the ranch to find Boone struggling with a difficult carving. She had ridden out on a crisp December morning, bringing Christmas cookies and plans for a quiet day together, but found him in the barn with a laboring heifer who was clearly in distress. "She's been at it for hours," Boone said, his voice tight with concern. "The calf is breached, and I can't get it turned." Clara had seen enough farm births to understand the gravity of the situation. Without proper intervention, both mother and calf would likely die. "What do you need me to do?" "Hold her head," Talk to her, keep her calm while I work, Boone said, already moving to wash his hands in a bucket of clean water. This is going to be rough. For the next hour, Clara knelt in the straw beside the heifer's head, stroking her neck and murmuring soft words, while Boone worked with infinite patience to reposition the calf. His hands, so large and powerful, moved with surprising delicacy as he maneuvered the unborn animal into the proper position for birth. "There," he said finally, sweat beading his forehead despite the cold air. "I think we've got it." The calf emerged in a rush of fluid, and for a terrifying moment, it lay motionless in the straw. Then Boone cleared its airways with gentle efficiency, and the small creature took its first shuddering breath. "It's a bull calf," Boone said, his voice filled with relief and satisfaction. "A strong one, by the look of him." Clara watched as the heifer began to clean her newborn, the natural instincts taking over now that the crisis had passed. The sight filled her with a deep sense of satisfaction. They had saved 2 lives through their combined efforts. "You did well," Boone said, looking at her with something that might have been admiration. "Not many women would have stayed calm through that." "I told you I wasn't afraid of hard work," Clara replied, wiping her hands on a clean rag. "Besides, we're partners now. Partners help each other." The word hung in the air between them, and Clara realized she had spoken a truth that went beyond their tentative courtship. They were partners, in the truest sense of the word, 2 people who could depend on each other when things got difficult. Later, as they sat in the kitchen sharing coffee and the cookies Clara had brought, Boone reached into his vest pocket and withdrew something small and worn. "I want to show you something," he said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. He placed a pocket watch on the table between them, its gold case tarnished with age but still elegant. Clara could see it had been well cared for, polished regularly despite its obvious years. "It was my father's," Boone said, "and his father's before him. It's the only thing I have that connects me to the family history, to the men who came before me." Clara picked up the watch carefully, feeling its weight in her palm. The inscription on the back was worn but still legible. "To Thomas Cutter, with love and faith in our future. Mary, 1824. "Your grandparents," Clara said softly. "Yes, they came west in a covered wagon, looking for a place to build something lasting. My grandfather died, young Indian attack, when my father was just 12. But my grandmother kept the watch, passed it down when my father married my mother. And now," Boone looked at her intently, "I've been thinking about what it means to carry on a family legacy. This ranch, this life, it's what my father and grandfather built. But it doesn't mean much if it dies with me." Clara understood what he was saying. "You want children. Someday, if we're blessed with them. But more than that, I want to build something that will last beyond our lifetimes. I want to create a legacy that honors the work my family has done." Clara felt a flutter of emotion that was part excitement, part fear. "That's a big responsibility." "It is," Boone agreed. "But I think it's also an opportunity to build something good, something that helps other people, something that makes the world a little better." "What did you have in mind?" Boone leaned forward, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "I've been thinking about expanding the horse breeding program, not just for profit, but to breed animals that would be useful to other ranchers, to families who need reliable horses for their own work. Quality animals at fair prices, horses that are trained with patience instead of broken with force." "That sounds wonderful," Clara said, meaning it. "You have such a gentle way with animals. I can see how horses would respond to that. Would you want to be part of it? The breeding program, I mean. It would take both of us to do it right. Someone to train the horses, someone to manage the business side, someone to care for the mares and foals." Clara felt her heart lift. Here was the contribution she had been hoping for, the way she could make this life truly her own. "I'd love to be part of it." "There's something else," Boone said, his voice growing more serious. "Something I need to tell you about my past." Clara waited, sensing that whatever he was about to share would be important. "The stories about me in town, some of them are true. I did kill a man, Clara. Not a bear, like they say, but a man. Clara felt her breath catch, but she forced herself to remain calm. Tell me what happened. It was 5 years ago, not long after my father died. I was in Denver, selling cattle, and I saw a man beating a woman in an alley behind the hotel where I was staying. She was small, maybe Mexican or Indian, and he was hitting her with his fists, calling her terrible names. Boone's hands clenched into fists as he spoke, and Clara could see the memory still caused him pain. I told him to stop. He laughed, said it was none of my business what he did to his property. That's when I knew she wasn't his wife. She was someone he'd bought, someone who had no choice about being there. What did you do? I pulled him off her. I didn't mean to hurt him badly, I just wanted him to stop. But I'm stronger than I sometimes realize, and when he came at me with a knife, I defended myself. Boone met her eyes. He hit his head when he fell. The doctor said he died instantly. Clara absorbed this information carefully. What happened to the woman? I helped her get to the mission. The sisters there took her in, helped her find her way back to her family. Boone's voice softened. She was just a girl, Clara. Maybe 16 years old. And you? Were there legal consequences? The sheriff investigated. There were witnesses who saw what happened, who testified that the man attacked me first. It was ruled self-defense. Boone looked down at his hands. But word got around. People heard that I'd killed a man in Denver, and the story grew in the telling. Clara reached across the table and placed her hand over his. You saved that girl's life. Maybe, but I also took a life, even if it was in defense of another. That's something I have to live with. Do you regret it? Boone was quiet for a long moment. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that there are men in this world who think they can own other people, who think violence is acceptable. But I don't regret protecting someone who couldn't protect herself. Clara felt a surge of emotion that was part admiration, part protective tenderness. That tells me everything I need to know about your character, Boone. You're not a violent man. You're a man who will use violence when necessary to protect the innocent. You're not afraid? Of you? No. Clara squeezed his hand. I'm honored that you trusted me enough to tell me the truth. The conversation had shifted something fundamental between them. Clara realized that Boone had just shared his deepest secret, his greatest vulnerability. He had trusted her with the knowledge that could destroy their relationship if she chose to let fear overrule understanding. There's something I need to tell you too, Clara said, about why I was so ready to leave my old life behind. Boone waited, giving her the same patient attention she had given him. There was a man in town who wouldn't take no for an answer. James Morrison, he owns the feed store. He'd been pursuing me for months, becoming more insistent and aggressive each time I refused him. He seemed to think that because I was alone, I should be grateful for any attention. Did he hurt you? He tried to. One evening, he cornered me behind the bakery when I was taking out the trash. He said he was tired of waiting, that a woman in my position couldn't afford to be choosy. Clara felt old anger rise in her chest. I managed to get away, but he made it clear that he wouldn't give up. Is that why you answered my notice? Partly. I was looking for a way out of that situation, but also for something more. I wanted a life where I could be valued for my character and my abilities, not just seen as someone who should be grateful for whatever scraps of affection were offered. Boone's jaw tightened. If he bothers you again... He won't, Clara said firmly, because I won't be living in town anymore. That is, if you'll have me permanently. The question hung between them, carrying the weight of everything they had shared. Boone looked at her for a long moment, his brown eyes serious and warm. Clara Lynn Porter, he said quietly, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Yes, Clara said without hesitation. Yes, I will. The pocket watch sat between them on the table, a symbol of the legacy they would build together, the future they would create from the foundation of honesty, trust, and shared purpose. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside the warm kitchen, two people who had found each other against all odds began to plan their life together. Clara's engagement to Boone Cutter sent ripples through Millbrook that reached every corner of the small community. The news spread quickly when she gave Henrik her notice at the bakery, and by evening, it seemed every person in town had an opinion about her decision. "You can't be serious," Mrs. Henderson said when she encountered Clara at the general store. "That man is dangerous. Everyone knows what happened in Denver." "I know exactly what happened in Denver," Clara replied calmly, loading supplies into her basket. "And I know the kind of man Boone is. I'm very happy with my choice." "But Clara, dear, you have options here in town. James Morrison has been asking about you, and he's a respectable businessman with a good income." Clara's hands stilled on the bag of flour she was lifting. "Mrs. Henderson, I need you to understand something. James Morrison is not an option for me. He's not a good man, regardless of his business success." The banker's wife looked shocked. "How can you say such a thing? The Morrison family has been pillars of this community for years." "Being a pillar of the community doesn't make someone a good husband," Clara said firmly. "I've made my choice, and I'd appreciate it if you would respect it." The conversation with Mrs. Henderson was typical of many Clara endured during her final weeks in town. Some people expressed genuine concern for her welfare, while others seemed more interested in gossiping about the scandal of a respectable woman choosing to marry the town's most feared resident. Through it all, Clara found strength in her growing certainty that she was making the right choice. Each visit to the ranch confirmed her belief that she and Boone were well suited to build a life together. They worked with increasing harmony, planning not just their wedding but their shared future. The wedding itself would be simple ceremony at the ranch, with the traveling minister who made rounds through the rural communities. Boone had suggested they could marry in town if Clara preferred, but she had no desire for a public ceremony that would only provide more fuel for gossip. "I'd rather be married where we'll be living," she told him. "This ranch is going to be our home. It seems right to start our married life here." Clara spent her evenings preparing for the transition, mending clothes that would need to last through hard ranch work, studying her mother's recipes for preserving and cooking in larger quantities, and reading everything she could find about horse breeding and training. Boone had given her several books on the subject, including a detailed manual written by a renowned trainer from Kentucky. "If we're going to do this right, we both need to understand the principles," he had said. "Good breeding isn't just about picking pretty animals, about understanding bloodlines, conformation, and temperament." Clara found herself fascinated by the complexity of the subject. There was science involved, but also artistry, the ability to see potential in a young horse, to understand how different bloodlines might complement each other, to recognize the subtle signs of intelligence and trainability that made the difference between a good horse and an exceptional one. "I've been thinking about starting with just 2 mares, Boone said during one of their planning sessions. "Lady's getting old, but she's still healthy enough for one more foal. And there's a mare for sale at the Hutchinson Ranch, good bloodlines, proven producer." "What about a stallion?" "That's the expensive part. A quality stallion costs more than I want to invest until we're sure the market is there. But I've heard about a man down in Wyoming who might be willing to arrange breeding for a fee rather than selling outright." Clara pulled out the notebook where she had been keeping track of their plans. "What if we started smaller, bred for quality riding horses rather than draft animals or racing stock? There's always a market for reliable family horses." "That's good thinking," Boone said, his voice warm with approval. "Smart, gentle horses that a woman could handle, or that would be safe for children. Horses like Lady, dependable and intelligent." They spent hours discussing the practical aspects of their venture, but Clara found herself equally interested in the emotional dimension of their partnership. Boone valued her opinions, listened to her suggestions, and incorporated her ideas into their plans. This wasn't a marriage where she would be expected to simply support his decisions. It was a true partnership where both of their skills and insights would be needed. One evening in late December, as they sat by the fire reviewing breeding records, Boone looked up from his papers with an expression Clara had come to recognize, the look that meant he was about to share something important. "Clara, there's something else we need to discuss before we marry." "What is it?" From a drawer in his desk, Boone withdrew a folded piece of white cotton fabric. He handed it to Clara, and she could see immediately what it was: wedding dress material, enough for a simple but elegant gown. "I know you probably have your own ideas about what to wear," Boone said, his voice uncertain. "But I hoped you might consider making a dress from this fabric." Clara unfolded the material, running her fingers over the fine cotton. It was beautiful, not fancy or elaborate, but good quality fabric that would make a dress suitable for a ranch wife's wedding. "It's lovely," she said softly. "But Boone, you didn't need to." "I wanted to," he interrupted gently. "I know this isn't the kind of wedding most women dream about. No church ceremony, no big celebration, no fancy dress from a store. I wanted to give you something special, something that would make the day feel important." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "The day will be important because I'm marrying you, but this is very thoughtful. Thank you. My mother was a good seamstress. She left behind patterns and sewing supplies. If you'd like, I could help you with the cutting and fitting." The image of Boone helping her sew her wedding dress was so unexpectedly tender that Clara had to blink back tears. "I'd like that very much." Over the following weeks, they worked together on the dress, in the evenings after the day's ranch work was done. Boone proved to have a surprisingly good eye for fit and proportion, and his large hands were surprisingly deft with needle and thread when delicate work was required. "My mother taught me," he explained when Clara commented on his skill. "She said every person should know how to mend their own clothes, regardless of their gender." "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was. I think she would have liked you." Clara found deep satisfaction in creating her wedding dress, especially with Boone's help. Each evening, spent working on the garment, felt like a step toward their shared future, a tangible symbol of the life they were building together. As her final day at the bakery approached, Clara felt a mixture of emotions, excitement about her new life, but also nostalgia for the independence she had worked so hard to achieve. Henrik had been kind about her leaving, even helping her pack her few possessions and arranging for someone to drive her belongings to the ranch. "You are making good choice," he told her in his heavily accented English. "Boone Cutter is good man. People here they do not understand, but good man does not mean soft man. Thank you, Henrik, for everything. You gave me a chance when I needed one. You work hard, make good bread, is fair trade." He paused, studying her face. "You are happy, yes?" "Yes," Clara said without hesitation. "I'm happy." The night before her wedding, Clara stayed in town one final time, sleeping in the small room above the bakery that had been her home for 3 years. She lay awake for a while, listening to the familiar sounds of the town settling for the night, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. Tomorrow, she would marry Boone Cutter and become Clara Cutter, wife and partner in an enterprise that would challenge every skill she possessed. She would trade the safety of her known life for the adventure of building something new with a man who had surprised her with his gentleness, his intelligence, and his capacity for devotion. The wedding dress hung on a hook nearby, white cotton gleaming in the moonlight, symbol of hope, of new beginnings, of two people who had found in each other exactly what they had been looking for. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of the rest of their lives, and Clara had never felt more ready for the future. Clara's wedding day dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline winter light that made the Montana landscape look like something from a fairy tale. She had risen early at the ranch, where she had spent the night in Boone's mother's room, preparing for the ceremony that would take place at noon when the traveling minister arrived. The morning passed peacefully as she and Boone made final preparations. Clara arranged wildflowers from Boone's preserved collection in mason jars around the main room, while Boone prepared a simple wedding feast with the help of supplies Clara had gathered over the past weeks. The atmosphere was calm and joyful, filled with the quiet anticipation of two people about to begin their life together. At 11:30, they heard the sound of a horse approaching, and both assumed it was Reverend Matthews arriving for the ceremony. But when Boone opened the door, the expression on his face immediately told Clara that something was wrong. "Can I help you?" Boone said, his voice carefully neutral. Clara moved to the window, where she could see the visitora man, in an expensive coat, riding a well-bred horse. Clearly not a local rancher or the modest minister they were expecting. Something about the stranger's bearing set her immediately on edge. "I'm looking for Clara Porter," the man said. "I was told in town that she might be found here." Clara's blood ran cold. She recognized that voice, though she hadn't heard it in 5 years. Moving to the door beside Boone, she found herself face to face with Thomas Garrett, a man she had hoped never to see again. "Hello, Clara," Thomas said, his smile carrying none of the warmth it had once held. "You're looking well." "What do you want, Thomas?" Clara asked, grateful for Boone's solid presence beside her. "Aren't you going to invite me in? It's been a long ride from St. Louis." "No," Boone said flatly. "State your business and move on." Thomas's smile faltered slightly as he took in Boone's imposing size. "I can see why you might be protective of Clara, but this is a family matter. Clara is my wife." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. "I am not your wife. I was never your wife." "Legally speaking, you are," Thomas said, reaching into his coat pocket and withdrawing a folded document. "This marriage certificate says otherwise." Clara felt the world tilt around her. "That's impossible. I never married you." "But you did sign this document, didn't you, when you thought you were signing employment papers for the position as governess to my sister's children?" The memory came flooding back those terrible weeks after her parents' death, when she had been desperate for work, any work that would allow her to survive. Thomas had seemed like a godsend then, offering her employment with his wealthy family in St. Louis. She had been so grateful, so trusting, that she had signed the papers he put in front of her without reading them carefully. "You tricked me," she whispered. "I convinced you to marry me," Thomas corrected. "The fact that you didn't understand what you were signing doesn't make the marriage any less legal. You're Mrs. Thomas Garrett, Clara, and you have been for 5 years." Boone stepped forward, his body radiating controlled anger. "Even if that's true, she's been living independently for years. Any court would recognize abandonment." "Ah, but you see, I never abandoned her. Clara ran away from our home without explanation. I've been searching for her ever since." Thomas's smile was triumphant. "I have witnesses who will testify that she was my wife, that she lived in my house, that she fled in the night without warning." Clara felt sick. She remembered those awful months in St. Louis, trapped in Thomas's house, slowly realizing that what she had thought was employment was actually an elaborate trap. Thomas had expected her to play the role of his wife, to share his bed, to pretend their marriage was real and consensual. When she had refused, he had become increasingly aggressive and controlling. "I left because you were trying to force yourself on me," Clara said, finding her voice. "Because you locked me in that house and told everyone I was your wife, when I had never agreed to marry you." "You signed the papers," Thomas repeated calmly. "What happened after that was simply the natural progression of a marriage. If you had been more compliant, we could have been very happy together." Boone's hands clenched into fists. "Get off my property." "I'm afraid I can't do that," Thomas said. "Not without my wife. You see, I've recently come into a substantial inheritance. Father died last month, but there's a condition. I must be married to claim the full amount." Clara's departure left me in a rather awkward position. "So you tracked me down," Clara said, understanding flooding through her. "This isn't about wanting me back. It's about money." "It's about reclaiming what's mine," Thomas said. "And Clara, you are legally mine. If you don't come with me willingly, I'll simply have the law compel you to return." "She's not going anywhere with you," Boone said, his voice deadly quiet. Thomas's eyes narrowed as he studied Boone. "You must be the famous Boone Cutter. I heard about you in town, the giant who killed a man in Denver. Quite a reputation you have." "You heard right," Boone said. "And if you threaten Clara again, you'll find out just how accurate those stories are." Now, Thomas said with false calm. "There's no need for violence. I'm simply here to collect my legal wife. Clara, gather your things. We're leaving." "No," Clara said, stepping closer to Boone. "I'm not going anywhere with you." Thomas sighed dramatically. "I was hoping we could handle this civilly, but I see you're going to be difficult." He reached into his other pocket and withdrew another document. "This is a warrant for your arrest, Clara. Desertion of a legal spouse. The sheriff in town was very cooperative when I explained the situation." Clara's heart sank. She could see the official seal on the document, could see that it appeared genuine. Thomas had clearly planned this carefully, using his wealth and connections to create a legal framework that would force her compliance. "Even if that's valid, it would take time to process," Boone said. "You can't just take her." "Actually, I can," Thomas said. "The warrant gives me the right to take her into custody immediately as the injured party. Of course, if she comes willingly, we can avoid all that unpleasantness." Clara felt trapped, just as she had 5 years ago in that house in St. Louis. Thomas had always been clever, always prepared with legal documents and official papers that made his actions seem legitimate. She could see the satisfaction in his eyes as he watched her realize the scope of his planning. "Clara," Boone said quietly, "you don't have to go with him. If she doesn't, I'll have you arrested for harboring a fugitive." Thomas said pleasantly, "Interfering with a legal marriage. I understand you've already had trouble with the law, Mr. Cutter. Another incident might not go so well for you." The threat was clear, and Clara could see that Thomas had researched Boone as thoroughly as he had prepared his legal trap. He knew about Denver, knew about Boone's reputation, and was prepared to use it against him. "Give us a few minutes," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," Thomas said magnanimously, "but don't take too long. I'd like to be well away from here before dark." Clara and Boone went inside, closing the door behind them. Clara felt as if she were drowning, pulled under by the undertow of a past she had thought safely behind her. "Clara, look at me," Boone said, taking her hands in his. "We'll fight this. We'll find a lawyer, challenge the validity of the marriage, prove that you were coerced." "How?" Clara asked desperately. "It will be my word against his, and he has documents, witnesses, money. I'm nobody, Boone. I have nothing to fight him with. You have me. And if I stay, he'll destroy you too. He'll find a way to have you arrested, or worse. I can't let that happen." Boone's jaw tightened. "So what are you saying?" Clara felt tears streaming down her face. "I'm saying that maybe I have to go with him, at least until we can find another way." "No," Boone said fiercely. "I won't let him take you, and I won't let him destroy you because of me." Clara reached up to touch his face. "Boone, I love you. That's why I have to protect you." The words hung between them, the first time either had spoken of love. It should have been a moment of joy, but instead it felt like goodbye. "Clara, promise me you won't do anything that will get you in trouble with the law. Promise me you'll find another way to fight this." Before Boone could answer, there was a knock at the door. "Time's up," Thomas called. Clara looked around the room that should have been the scene of her wedding, at the flowers she had arranged, at the white dress hanging in the corner. In the space of 10 minutes, her entire future had been stolen from her again. "I'll find a way," Boone said desperately. "I'll get you back, Clara. I promise." "I know you will," Clara said, though her heart was breaking. "I know you will." She opened the door to face Thomas, who was holding what looked like a wanted poster. As she stepped closer, Clara could see it was exactly that, a poster with her name and description, offering a reward for information about her whereabouts. "Insurance," Thomas explained with a smile. "I've had these posted in towns throughout the territory. You've been a wanted woman for months, Clara. People have been looking for you." The scope of his planning was breathtaking and terrifying. Thomas had turned her into a fugitive, created a legal narrative that painted her as a criminal rather than a victim. He had systematically destroyed any chance she might have had to build a new life. "Shall we go?" Thomas asked, gesturing toward his horse. Clara looked back at Boone one last time, memorizing his face, drawing strength from the love and determination she saw there. Then she walked toward the horse that would carry her back into a nightmare she had thought she had escaped forever. The wedding that should have been the beginning of her new life had become instead the end of her brief taste of freedom. But as she mounted behind Thomas and felt his arms close around her like a cage, Clara held on to one thought. Boone Cutter was not a man who gave up easily. He would find a way to bring her home. Boone stood on his porch for a long time after the sound of Thomas Garrett's horse had faded into the distance, his hands clenched into fists and his heart pounding with a rage, unlike anything he had ever experienced. Clara was gone, taken by a man who had used legal trickery and manipulation to steal her freedom, and Boone felt more helpless than he ever had in his adult life. The wedding flowers still sat in their mason jars, mocking him with their cheerful brightness. The white dress hung in the corner like a ghost of the future that had been snatched away. Everything in the house spoke of the life he and Clara had planned together, the partnership they had been about to formalize, the love they had finally acknowledged. But rage alone wouldn't bring Clara back. Boone forced himself to think clearly, to channel the strategic thinking that had served him well in difficult situations before. Thomas Garrett had the advantage of preparation and legal documentation, but Boone had resources of his own, including knowledge of the territory and connections that a city man like Garrett wouldn't expect. His first stop was the Hutchinson Ranch, where old Pete Hutchinson had lived long enough to know every lawyer, judge, and sheriff within 100 miles. If anyone could help Boone understand the legal situation, it would be Pete. "That's a hell of a thing," Pete said after Boone had explained the situation. "This Garrett fellow sounds like a real snake in the grass. Can he really force her to go back with him, even if the marriage was obtained through deception?" Pete scratched his grizzled beard thoughtfully. "Unfortunately, yes, at least in the short term. A marriage certificate is a legal document, and unless Clara can prove it was obtained fraudulently, the law will recognize it as valid. The fact that she lived with him afterward, even briefly, will work against her. So there's nothing we can do?" "I didn't say that." Pete's eyes glinted with something that might have been anticipation. "There's a lawyer in Helena, Samuel Morrison, who specializes in cases involving women's rights and fraudulent contracts. He's expensive, but he's good. If anyone can find a way to invalidate that marriage, it's him." Boone felt a flicker of hope. How long would something like that take? Months, maybe longer. These things move slowly through the courts. "Clara doesn't have months," Boone said grimly. "From what she told me about this man, every day she's with him is dangerous." Pete nodded, understanding. "Then you'll need to buy time while the legal wheels turn. Make it difficult for him to get her back to St. Louis. Give the lawyer time to work." "How do I do that?" "Well," Pete said with a slow smile, "it seems to me that a man traveling with a reluctant woman might encounter all sorts of delays. Bad weather, difficult roads, maybe even some helpful folks who might offer assistance to a lady in distress." Boone understood immediately. Pete wasn't suggesting anything illegal, but he was pointing out that Thomas Garrett was now traveling through territory where Boone had friends and allies, people who would be willing to help if they understood the situation. "I need to send a telegram to this lawyer," Boone said. "And then I need to track their route. The telegram office is in town. As for tracking them, well, a man like Garrett is going to stick to the main roads. He won't know the back trails and shortcuts like we do." Boone rode hard for Millbrook, his mind racing with plans. At the telegraph office, he sent a carefully worded message to Samuel Morrison in Helena, explaining the situation and requesting immediate assistance. The cost was steep, but Boone didn't hesitate. He would spend every penny he had to get Clara back. His next stop was the sheriff's office, where he found Sheriff Williams examining the warrant Thomas had shown them. "I've been thinking about this situation," Williams said when Boone entered. "Something doesn't sit right with me about that fellow who came through here." "What do you mean?" "Too slick, too prepared. Had an answer for every question, documentation for every claim. In my experience, when something looks that perfect, it usually isn't." Boone felt another flicker of hope. "Are you saying the warrant might not be valid?" "I'm saying I'd like to verify it with the issuing authority before I act on it again. Unfortunately, that will take time." Williams gave Boone a meaningful look. "Could be days before I hear back. And in the meantime, if someone were to say, encounter this Garrett fellow and have concerns about the welfare of the woman traveling with him, well, that would be a matter for local investigation." Boone understood. The sheriff was giving him unofficial permission to intervene, as long as he could frame it as a legitimate concern for Clara's safety. His final stop in town was the general store, where he purchased supplies for what might be a long pursuit. As he was loading his saddlebags, he encountered Henrik, who had clearly heard about the morning's events. "This is terrible thing," Henrik said, his accent thick with emotion. "Clara is good woman. She does not deserve this." "I'm going to get her back," Boone said simply. "Good. You need help?" Boone looked at the old Danish baker, surprised by the offer. This could be dangerous. "Clara helped me many times when I need it. I help her now." Henrik's face was set with determination. "Besides, I fight in wars before I come to America. I am not too old to fight again." The offer touched Boone more than he could say. "Thank you, but I think I can handle this myself." "You sure? Two men better than one when trouble comes." "I'm sure, but if you hear any word about where they're headed or when they passed, send word to the CCC." Henrik nodded solemnly. "I do this thing. You bring Clara home safe." Boone rode out of town as the afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the mountains, his rifle secured in its scabbard and his saddlebags filled with supplies for an extended pursuit. He had a good idea of the route. Thomas would take the main road east toward the railroad, where he could get Clara back to St. Louis quickly and safely. But Boone knew these mountains and valleys better than any outsider ever could. He knew shortcuts that would allow him to travel faster than someone sticking to the established roads. More importantly, he knew people, ranchers, trappers, and settlers who would be willing to help if they understood what was at stake. The first of these was Mary Hutchinson, Pete's daughter-in-law, who ran a small inn at the crossroads, 20 miles east of Millbrook. Boone arrived there just as darkness was falling, and Mary confirmed what he had hoped to hear. "A man and woman came through about 2 hours ago," she said. "City fellow, well-dressed, riding a good horse. The woman was with him, but she didn't look happy about it." "Did they stay?" "He asked about a room, but she said they should keep riding. Strange thing, though when he wasn't looking, she dropped this near the door." Mary held up a small piece of white fabric, torn from Clara's wedding dress. Boone's heart clenched as he recognized it. Clara was leaving him a trail, letting him know she was fighting back in the only way she could. Which way did they go? "East, toward Miller's Creek. But they'll have to stop soon. That road gets dangerous in the dark, especially for someone who doesn't know it." Boone thanked Mary and rode on, following the trail Clara was leaving for him. At Miller's Creek, he found another scrap of fabric tied to a tree branch near the ford. Thomas might have the legal advantage, but Clara was proving that she wasn't going to be a passive victim. As full darkness fell, Boone made the decision to push on, despite the risk. He knew this country well enough to travel by moonlight, and he suspected that Thomas would stop for the night rather than risk the unfamiliar terrain. If Boone was right, he might be able to catch up to them before morning. His instincts proved correct. Just after midnight, he spotted the glow of a campfire in a sheltered valley beside the creek. Moving carefully, Boone worked his way closer until he could see the camp clearly. Thomas had set up near the water, his horse picketed nearby. Clara sat by the fire, but even from a distance, Boone could see the rope that bound her hands. The sight of Clara tied like a prisoner sent fury coursing through Boone's veins. Whatever legal authority Thomas claimed to have, this was kidnapping, pure and simple. No legitimate husband would need to tie his wife to keep her from escaping. Boone studied the camp layout, looking for the best approach. Thomas appeared to be asleep in his bedroll, though Boone couldn't be certain. Clara was sitting upright, staring into the fire, clearly unable or unwilling to sleep. The horse was positioned between the camp and Boone's location, which would make a silent approach difficult. As Boone watched, Clara stood up and walked toward the edge of the firelight, moving carefully because of her bound hands. She appeared to be scanning the darkness beyond the camp, as if she sensed his presence. The thought that she might be hoping for rescue, might be watching for him specifically, made Boone's chest tight with emotion. He had to resist the urge to charge into the camp immediately. A direct confrontation might put Clara in danger, especially if Thomas was armed. Better to wait, to watch, to find the right moment when he could act without risking her safety. That moment came an hour later when Thomas rose to tend to the fire. As he bent over the flames, his back to Clara, Boone saw her frantically gesture toward the darkness where he was hidden. She had seen him, or at least sensed his presence, and was trying to communicate something. Boone moved closer, using the sound of the creek to mask any noise he might make. When he was close enough to hear voices, he stopped and listened. "Told you, I need to rest," Clara was saying, her voice steady despite her circumstances. "We'll rest when we reach the railroad," Thomas replied coldly. "I'm not spending any more time in this God-forsaken wilderness than I have to." "Then untie my hands. They're going numb." "So you can run away again?" "I don't think so." "Where would I go? We're in the middle of nowhere." Thomas laughed harshly. "You'd be surprised what people will do when they're desperate. Besides, I rather like you this way, helpless, dependent on me for everything. It's how a wife should be." Boone's hands clenched on his rifle. The casual cruelty in Thomas's voice, the satisfaction he took in Clara's helplessness, confirmed everything Boone had suspected about the man's character. "You can't keep me tied up forever," Clara said. "People will notice, will ask questions. By the time we reach St. Louis, you'll be so grateful for civilization that you'll behave yourself. And once we're back home, well, you'll remember your place soon enough." The threat in his voice was unmistakable, and Boone had heard enough. He began moving again, working his way around the camp to approach from Thomas's blind side. But as he moved, a branch cracked under his foot, and Thomas's head snapped up. "What was that?" Thomas said, reaching for something beside his bedroll. "Probably just an animal," Clara said quickly. "There are lots of wild animals in these mountains." "Maybe." Thomas stood up, and Boone could see he was holding a pistol. "But I think I'll take a look around." Boone froze as Thomas began walking in his direction, the gun ready in his hand. The moonlight was bright enough that Thomas would spot him if he got much closer. Boone had to make a choice: retreat and lose this opportunity, or act now while he still had the element of surprise. Before he could decide, Clara made the choice for him. As Thomas stepped away from the fire, she suddenly threw herself sideways, rolling into him and knocking him off balance. Thomas stumbled, cursing, and the gun went off harmlessly into the air. Boone burst from his hiding place, covering the distance to the camp in seconds. Thomas was just recovering his balance when Boone's fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling into the dirt. The gun went flying, landing somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight. "Clara, are you hurt?" Boone said, kneeling beside her. "I'm fine," she said, tears of relief streaming down her face. "I knew you'd come." Boone quickly untied the ropes binding her hands, then helped her to her feet. Thomas was groaning but still conscious, blood trickling from his split lip. "You have no right," Thomas said thickly. "She's my wife. You're interfering with a legal marriage." "I'm preventing a kidnapping," Boone replied calmly. "No legal husband ties up his wife and threatens her. You'll pay for this. I'll have the law on you." "Good luck with that." Boone helped Clara toward his horse, which he had left hidden in the trees. "The sheriff is already looking into the validity of your warrant. Turns out he has some questions about your documentation." Thomas's face went pale in the firelight. "You can't prove anything." "Maybe not, but I can make your life very difficult while we try." Boone mounted his horse and helped Clara up behind him. "Stay away from her, Garrett. Stay away from both of us. Next time I won't be so gentle." As they rode away into the darkness, Clara's arms tight around his waist, Boone felt a fierce satisfaction. He had Clara back, but more than that, he had sent a clear message to Thomas Garrett. The legal battle might continue, but the physical threat was over. "Are you really all right?" Boone asked as they put distance between themselves and the camp. "I am now," Clara said, her voice muffled against his back. "I knew you'd find me. I've never been so happy to see anyone in my life." "It's not over yet," Boone warned. "We still have to deal with the legal complications." "I know, but we'll face them together." Clara's arms tightened around him. "We're partners, remember. Partners don't give up on each other." As they rode through the moonlit landscape toward home, Boone felt a deep sense of rightness. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would meet them as they had met this crisis together, with courage and determination, and with the kind of love that didn't break under pressure but grew stronger. Clara and Boone arrived back at the Triple C Ranch, just as dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Clara had never been so grateful to see the familiar buildings, the neat fences, the peaceful valley that represented everything good in her life. But even as relief flooded through her, she knew their troubles were far from over. "He'll come after us," she said as Boone helped her down from the horse. "Thomas isn't the kind of man who accepts defeat easily." "I'm counting on it," Boone replied grimly. "This time we'll be ready for him." They had barely reached the porch when they saw riders approaching from the direction of town, 3 men on horseback, moving at a steady pace that suggested official business. Clara's heart sank as she recognized the lead rider as Sheriff Williams. Though she was surprised to see Henrik and another man she didn't recognize riding with him. "Boone Cutter," the sheriff called as they approached. "I need to speak with you about the incident last night." "What incident?" Boone asked, though his voice was carefully neutral. "Thomas Garrett claims you assaulted him and kidnapped his wife. Says you're holding Mrs. Garrett against her will." Clara stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. "I'm not Mrs. Garrett, Sheriff Williams, except on a piece of paper I was tricked into signing, and Mr. Cutter rescued me from a man who had me tied up like a criminal." The sheriff's eyebrows rose. "Tied up, you say?" Clara held up her wrists, which still bore rope marks from the previous night. "See for yourself. Does that look like the behavior of a legitimate husband?" The unknown rider dismounted and approached them. He was a tall, thin man with graying hair and intelligent eyes, dressed in the kind of expensive clothes that marked him as a city professional. "Miss Porter, I'm Samuel Morrison, attorney at law from Helena. I received Mr. Cutter's telegram and took the liberty of investigating Mr. Garrett's claims." Clara felt a surge of hope. "What did you find?" "Some very interesting information." Morrison reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio. "It seems Mr. Garrett has used this particular scheme before. I found records of at least 2 other women who signed similar employment contracts that turned out to be marriage certificates." "Can you prove it?" Boone asked. "I can prove enough to raise serious questions about the validity of this marriage. More importantly, I can prove that Mr. Garrett obtained the marriage certificate through fraud and deception." Morrison opened his portfolio. "I have affidavits from servants in the Garrett household who witnessed his treatment of Miss Porter, including testimony that she was held against her will and threatened with violence if she tried to leave." Clara felt her knees go weak with relief. "So the marriage can be invalidated?" "With the evidence I've gathered, yes. It will take time to work through the courts, but I'm confident we can have the marriage declared null and void." "That's wonderful news," Clara said, tears pricking her eyes. "But how much time?" "Several weeks, perhaps a month or 2. These things—" The sound of approaching horses interrupted Morrison's explanation. A group of riders was coming up the valley. Thomas Garrett accompanied by 4 hard-looking men who were clearly not local ranchers. Clara instinctively moved closer to Boone, who stepped protectively in front of her. "Sheriff," Thomas called as he approached, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I trust you're here to arrest these criminals for assault and kidnapping." "Actually, Mr. Garrett, I'm here to investigate your claims," Sheriff Williams replied coolly. "And what I'm finding raises some serious questions." Thomas's confidence faltered slightly. "What kind of questions?" Morrison stepped forward. "Questions about your pattern of fraudulent marriages, Mr. Garrett. Questions about forged documents and coerced signatures. Questions about the treatment of women in your custody." For the first time since Clara had known him, Thomas Garrett looked genuinely rattled. His eyes darted between Morrison, the sheriff, and the men he had brought with him, who suddenly looked less like legitimate law enforcement and more like hired thugs. "I don't know what lies you've been told," Thomas said, his voice rising, "but Clara is legally my wife, and I have every right to take her home." "Not according to these documents," Morrison said, holding up several papers. Sworn statements from your former household staff, court records from St. Louis showing complaints filed against you by other women, and most importantly, evidence that the signature on your marriage certificate was obtained under false pretenses. Clara watched the color drain from Thomas's face as the scope of Morrison's investigation became clear. The lawyer had done more than simply challenge the validity of their marriage. He had uncovered a pattern of behavior that could result in serious criminal charges. "You have no authority here," Thomas said desperately. "These are matters for Missouri courts to decide." "Actually," Sheriff Williams interjected, "kidnapping is a federal crime, and holding someone against their will is a crime in any territory. Miss Porter has rope marks on her wrists and multiple witnesses to your threatening behavior." One of Thomas's companions leaned over and whispered something in his ear. Thomas listened, then nodded curtly. "Gentlemen, it seems we have a difference of opinion about the facts. Perhaps we should let the courts sort this out." "That's exactly what we intend to do," Morrison said. "But in the meantime, Miss Porter will remain here under the protection of local law enforcement until the matter is resolved." Thomas's face darkened with anger. "You think you can hide behind these local yokels and some small-town lawyer? I have resources you can't imagine. I have connections in Washington, judges who owe me favors, politicians who depend on my family's money." "And I have the truth," Morrison replied calmly, "which tends to be more persuasive in a court of law." Clara had remained silent during this exchange, but now she stepped forward, her chin raised with quiet dignity. "Thomas, it's over. You can't force me to live a lie anymore. Find yourself another victim for your inheritance scheme." Thomas's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the rage and desperation beneath. "You ungrateful little fool. Do you have any idea what I've done for you? What I've spent trying to find you?" "You've done nothing for me," Clara said firmly. "You've only tried to use me. The difference is that now I understand the distinction." Thomas turned to his companions, his voice sharp with command. "Take her. The sheriff can't stop all of us." It was a mistake that revealed the true nature of his character and his intentions. The moment he gave that order, he moved from the gray area of civil dispute into the clear territory of criminal behavior. Sheriff Williams drew his gun with practiced ease. "I wouldn't advise that, Mr. Garrett. You're already in enough trouble without adding assault on a peace officer to your charges." Henrik, who had been quiet throughout the confrontation, suddenly spoke up. "You want to take Clara by force? You go through me first." The old baker's voice carried an authority that surprised everyone present. Clara realized that Henrik hadn't just come along for moral support, had positioned himself strategically, ready to act if violence erupted. Morrison seized the moment to press his advantage. "Mr. Garrett, I strongly advise you to accept the situation and withdraw your claims. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and continuing this course of action will only result in criminal charges that could see you imprisoned." Thomas looked around the group assembled against him, the sheriff, with his gun drawn, the lawyer with his damning evidence, Henrik with his determined expression, and Boone standing like an immovable mountain between Thomas and Clara. For the first time, he seemed to understand that his carefully laid plans had completely unraveled. "This isn't over," he said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "I'll appeal this decision. I'll find other courts, other judges." "You're welcome to try," Morrison said, "but I should warn you that I've already filed complaints with the authorities in Missouri regarding your previous fraudulent marriages. You may find yourself facing more immediate legal concerns when you return home." The implications of Morrison's words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He had come to Montana expecting to collect Clara and return triumphantly to claim his inheritance. Instead, he was facing the destruction of his entire scheme and possible criminal prosecution. Clara watched as the man who had terrorized her for so long finally faced the consequences of his actions. She felt no satisfaction in his defeat, only relief that his power over her was finally broken. "Goodbye, Thomas," she said quietly. "I hope someday you find a way to live honestly." Thomas's response was a snarl of rage, but his companions were already pulling him away. clearly unwilling to face the sheriff's drawn gun or risk criminal charges themselves. As they rode away, Clara felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had carried for 5 long years. The nightmare was finally over. She was free. The silence that followed Thomas Garrett's departure felt profound and healing, like the quiet after a fierce storm has passed. Clara stood on the porch of what she now knew would truly be her home, surrounded by people who had risked their own safety to protect her freedom. The morning sun seemed brighter, the mountain air cleaner, the future suddenly full of possibilities again. "Well," Sheriff Williams said, holstering his gun, "I'd say that's about as clear-cut a case of attempted kidnapping as I've ever seen. Mr. Morrison, I'll need copies of those documents for my report." "Of course," Morrison replied, organizing his papers. "I'll also need Miss Porter to sign some additional affidavits, but the legal proceedings should move quickly now that we have Garrett's admission of intent to take her by force." Clara felt Boone's steady presence beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "How long before the marriage is officially invalidated?" she asked. "With Garrett's behavior today and the evidence we've gathered, I'd say 2 weeks at most," Morrison said confidently. "No judge will uphold a marriage obtained through fraud, especially when the plaintiff has demonstrated such clear criminal intent." Henrik stepped forward, his weathered face creased with relief and satisfaction. "Clara, you come back to town when you are ready. We celebrate this victory properly." "Thank you, Henrik," Clara said, moved by the old baker's loyalty. "Thank you for everything you've done for me." "You are a good person. Good people deserve help when they need it." Henrik mounted his horse, then paused. "Boone, you take care of our Clara. She has been through much." "I will," Boone promised solemnly. "She'll never have to face anything like this alone again." After the others had departed, Clara and Boone found themselves alone for the first time since the crisis began. The wedding dress still hung in the corner where Clara had left it the day before, and the flowers they had arranged for their ceremony were beginning to wilt in their mason jars. "I thought I'd lost you," Boone said quietly, pulling Clara into his arms. "When he rode away with you yesterday, I thought—" "You didn't lose me," Clara interrupted, resting her head against his chest. "You saved me. Again." "We saved each other," Boone corrected. "You were the one who fought back, who left me a trail to follow, who knocked him down when I needed the distraction." Clara smiled up at him. "Partners, remember?" "Partners," Boone agreed, then grew serious. "Clara, I need to ask you something important." "What is it?" "When Morrison makes the marriage invalidation official, when you're truly free of Thomas Garrett forever, will you marry me? Really marry me this time, without any shadows from the past?" Clara felt her heart swell with love and certainty. "Boone Cutter, I would be honored to be your wife. In 2 weeks, or 2 months, or whenever the law says I'm free to choose my own future, yes, I will marry you." Boone's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Then we have a wedding to plan. Again." "Actually," Clara said, looking around at the wilted flowers and the dress that had waited patiently for its moment, "I think we have everything we need right here." Over the following days, Clara and Boone settled into a routine that felt both familiar and new. Clara moved her few possessions from town to the ranch permanently, transforming Boone's mother's room into her own space while they waited for the legal formalities to be completed. The threat of Thomas Garrett had brought unexpected allies into their lives. Morrison proved to be not just an excellent lawyer, but a genuine friend, visiting the ranch to update them on the legal proceedings and staying to share meals and conversation. The revelation of Thomas's scheme had created a minor sensation in legal circles, and Morrison was using the case to push for stronger protections for women against fraudulent marriage contracts. Sheriff Williams had also become a frequent visitor, drawn partly by his genuine concern for their welfare and partly by his growing friendship with Boone. Clara learned that the sheriff had always suspected there was more to the giant cowboy than the town gossip suggested, and the crisis had given him a chance to see Boone's true character. Most surprisingly, several women from town began visiting Clara at the ranch, including some who had previously been distant or disapproving. Word of her ordeal and Boone's heroic rescue had spread throughout the community, transforming their love story from a scandal into something approaching legend. "It's funny how people's opinions can change," Clara observed one afternoon as she and Boone worked together in the garden, preparing the soil for spring planting. "They're seeing us the way we really are, instead of the way rumor painted us." Boone replied, his hands gentle as he helped her plant herb seeds. "Sometimes it takes a crisis to show people what really matters." "What really matters to you, Boone?" He paused in his work, looking at her with those warm brown eyes that had first convinced her he was nothing like the monster the town imagined. "This," he said simply, "working together, building something good, having someone to share the quiet moments with. Having you." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "That's all I want too. A life built on truth and partnership and love." "And children someday?" Boone asked tentatively. "Yes," Clara said without hesitation. "Children who will grow up knowing they're wanted and loved, who will never doubt their place in the world." That evening, they sat together on the porch swing Boone had built for her, watching the sun set over the valley that would be their home for the rest of their lives. The marriage certificate that had finally, officially, been declared null and void lay on the table beside them, along with the new marriage license they would use for their real wedding the following weekend. "Are you nervous?" Clara asked. "About the wedding?" "No," Boone said, his arm tightening around her. "About spending the rest of my life with the woman I love? Not even a little bit." "Good," Clara said, settling more comfortably against his shoulder. "Because I have plans for us," Boone cut her. "Big plans." "Tell me about them." "Well, there's the horse breeding program we discussed. I've been reading more about bloodlines and training methods, and I think we could really build something special." "What else?" "A family. Children who will help us run this ranch someday, who will carry on what your father and grandfather started." "And?" Clara smiled. "And a life so full of love and purpose that we'll never again doubt we made the right choice in finding each other." Boone turned to kiss her, a gentle, promising kiss that spoke of all the tomorrows they would share. "I love your plans, Clara Cutter." "I'm not Clara Cutter yet," she reminded him teasingly. "You will be in 6 days," Boone said confidently, "and then nothing, and no one will ever separate us again." As the stars came out over the Montana landscape, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had come to this ranch as a lonely woman seeking peaceful companionship, and she had found instead a love deeper and more meaningful than she had ever imagined possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the daily work of running a ranch, the gradual building of their horse breeding program, the slow process of becoming not just husband and wife, but true partners in every sense of the word. But tonight, sitting in the arms of the man who had rescued her in every way that mattered, Clara felt nothing but gratitude for the courage that had brought them together. The gentle giant who had been too feared to find love, and the practical woman who had been too careful to risk her heart, had discovered that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the simplest decisions. Clara had answered a notice on a bulletin board, and in doing so, had found not just a husband, but a home. Not just security, but passionate purpose. Not just companionship, but the kind of love that transforms everything it touches. 5 years later, Clara Cutter stood in the doorway of the Triple C Ranch house, watching her husband teach their 3-year-old son how to carve a wooden horse. The spring afternoon was warm and peaceful, filled with the sounds of cattle lowing in the pasture and the gentle nickering of horses in the paddock they had built for their growing breeding program. Little Thomas, named for Boone's grandfather rather than the man who had once threatened their happiness, sat on his father's lap, his small hands guided by Boone's large ones as they shaped the wood with careful strokes. The child had inherited his father's gentle nature and his mother's quick intelligence, creating a combination that filled Clara's heart with joy every day. "Mama, look," Thomas called, holding up the partially carved horse. "Papa's teaching me to make horses." "I can see that," Clara said, walking over to examine their work. "It's going to be beautiful." The carved horses had become something of a tradition at the Triple C. Boone made them for the children of neighboring ranchers, for special occasions, and as gifts for the families who bought horses from their breeding program. Word of his skill had spread throughout the territory, and Clara often found herself packaging carved animals to send to customers along with their horses. "Mrs. Cutter," called a voice from the yard, and Clara looked up to see Sarah Martinez approaching with her twin daughters. Sarah and her husband Miguel had purchased their first horses from the Triple C 2 years earlier, and the families had become close friends. "Sarah, wonderful to see you," Clara said, embracing her friend. "How are the girls?" "Growing too fast," Sarah laughed, watching as the twins immediately ran to pet the horses in the nearest paddock. "Miguel sent me to ask if you have any yearlings ready for training. The daughters are determined to learn to ride properly." "We have just the horses for them," Clara said. "Gentle, smart, and patient with young riders. Boone has been working with them specifically for children." This had become their specialty breeding and training horses that were not just beautiful and strong, but also intelligent and gentle enough for families. The Triple C had gained a reputation throughout Montana and beyond for producing animals that combined the best qualities of strength and temperament. "How is the new baby?" Clara asked, noticing Sarah's slightly tired expression. "Keeping us awake but healthy," Sarah smiled. "You and Boone should come for dinner soon and meet little Roberto." "We'd love that," Clara said, then placed a protective hand on her own slightly rounded belly. "Though I may need to sit down frequently, this one seems determined to make his presence known early." Sarah's eyes lit up with delight. "Another baby, when?" "Late fall, according to the doctor in Helena. Boone is convinced it's going to be a girl this time." "And what do you think?" Clara smiled. "I think as long as the baby is healthy, I'll be happy either way." After Sarah and her daughters left with promises to return for the horses, Clara found herself alone with Boone and Thomas in the comfortable quiet of late afternoon. The house had grown over the years. They had added a proper nursery, expanded the kitchen, and built a workshop where Boone could pursue his carving during the long winter evenings. But the most significant addition was the small cradle that sat in the corner of the main room, hand-carved by Boone, with intricate details that spoke of his growing confidence as an artist. It had held Thomas as a baby, and would soon hold his younger sibling. "Tell me about the horses," Clara said, settling into the rocking chair that had replaced the original furniture in the main room. "The Martinez girls will love the bay mare," Boone said, continuing to guide Thomas's hands as they worked. "She's got the sweetest temperament and enough spirit to keep them interested without being challenging." "And the breeding program?" "We have 3 mares confirmed in foal for next spring, and I've had inquiries from as far away as Colorado about our training methods." Clara felt a deep satisfaction at their success. What had started as a dream discussed over coffee in this very room had become a thriving business that allowed them to make a living while doing work they both loved. "I had a letter from Samuel Morrison today," Clara said. "He wanted us to know that Thomas Garrett was convicted of fraud in Missouri last month. He'll be spending the next several years in prison." Boone looked up from his carving. "How do you feel about that?" Clara considered the question seriously. "Relieved, I suppose. It means other women won't fall victim to his schemes. But mostly, I just feel grateful that chapter of my life is completely closed." "Good," Boone said simply. "The past is past. What matters is the future we're building." As if to emphasize his father's point, Thomas held up the wooden horse, which now clearly resembled the animal it was meant to represent. "Done, Papa." "Not quite," Boone said with a smile. "We still need to sand it smooth and paint it, but you did excellent work." Clara watched her son beam with pride at his father's praise, and felt her heart swell with love for both of them. This was the life she had dreamed of during those long, lonely years above the Beccaria, life filled with meaningful work, growing love, and the simple joys of family. "Mama," Thomas said, climbing down from his father's lap and running to Clara, "can we ride Lady before dinner?" "If your father says it's safe," Clara said, looking to Boone for confirmation. "Lady would be insulted if we didn't include her in our evening routine," Boone said, rising and stretching. She's getting old, but she still expects her daily attention from her favorite boy. As they walked toward the barn together, Clara felt the baby shift in her womb and smiled at the sensation. By this time next year, there would be 4 of them making this evening walk, 4 voices joining in the comfortable conversations that had become the soundtrack of their daily life. The ranch had prospered beyond their most optimistic projections, but Clara knew their real success wasn't measured in acres or income or reputation. Their success was measured in the trust they had built, the love they shared, and the legacy they were creating for their children. "Clara," Boone said as they reached the barn where Lady waited patiently in her stall, "do you ever regret answering that notice?" Clara looked at her husband, still gentle, still thoughtful, still possessed of the quiet strength that had first drawn her to him, and felt the same certainty she had experienced on that first ride to his ranch. "Never," she said firmly, "not for a single moment. Even when things got difficult?" "Especially then," Clara said, reaching for his hand. "The difficult times showed me what we were really made of, what our love could survive. I wouldn't trade our story for any other." Boone lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I love you, Mrs. Cutter." "I love you too, Mr. Cutter, today, tomorrow, and for all the years to come." As the sun set over the Triple C Ranch, painting the Montana sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, the Cutter family went about their evening routine with the comfortable ease of people who had found exactly where they belonged in the world. Clara watched Boone lift Thomas onto Lady's back for a gentle ride around the paddock, the old mare stepping carefully as she had done countless times before. The sight filled Clara with the same deep contentment she had felt on that first evening when she had seen Boone's carved horse and understood that beneath his fearsome exterior lived an artist's soul. The notice on the bulletin board that had started it all seemed like a lifetime ago, though Clara could still remember every word: seeking a wife, peaceful company, honest and hard-working. Boone had asked for exactly what he could offer, and in doing so, had found exactly what he needed. "Mama, look at me," Thomas called from Lady's back, his small hands gripping the reins with growing confidence. "I see you, sweetheart," Clara called back. "You're becoming quite the horseman." As she watched her son and husband together, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect peace. They had faced challenges that might have destroyed a weaker partnership. Thomas Garrett's threats, the legal complications, the gradual process of building trust and intimacy between two people who had learned to guard their hearts carefully. But each challenge had only strengthened their bond, proving that what they had built together was worth fighting for. Their love had grown, not in spite of difficulties, but because of the way they had chosen to face those difficulties together. "Time for dinner," Clara called as the last light faded from the sky. "One more time around," Thomas pleaded. "Tomorrow," Boone said firmly but kindly. "Lady needs her rest, and so do you." As they walked back to the house, Thomas chattering excitedly about his ride and his wooden horse and his plans for tomorrow, Clara felt the baby stir again and smiled. Soon there would be another voice joining their evening conversations, another small person to love and protect and guide into the world. The house welcomed them with warmth and light, the familiar comfort of home earned through years of shared joys and weathered storms. Clara had never imagined, during those lonely years above the bakery, that such happiness was possible, that love could be both passionate and peaceful, that partnership could bring both security and adventure. After Thomas was tucked into bed with his new wooden horse beside him on the pillow, Clara and Boone sat together on the porch swing he had built for her so long ago. The night was clear and cold, perfect for watching stars emerge over the valley they had made their own. "I've been thinking," Boone said, his arm around Clara, as they swayed gently in the evening breeze. "About what?" "About that carved cradle in the corner. It's seen good use with Thomas, but I'm thinking this new baby might need something special of his or her own." "What did you have in mind?" "A rocking horse, maybe. Something that could grow with the child, become a family heirloom like my grandfather's pocket watch." Clara smiled in the darkness. "I think that's a wonderful idea. Something beautiful and lasting, made with love." Everything important should be made with love, Boone said quietly. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the peaceful sounds of the ranch settling for the night. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate, and Clara thought about the simple miracle of finding the right person to share life's journey with. Nobody had wanted to be the giant cowboy's wife until she saw his gentle heart. But Clara knew now that the truth was more complex and more beautiful than that simple story suggested. She hadn't just seen Boone's gentle heart, she had recognized in him a kindred spirit, someone who understood that the best things in life were built slowly, carefully, with patience and dedication and unwavering commitment. "Clara," Boone said softly, "thank you." "For what?" "For having the courage to answer my notice, for seeing past what everyone else saw, for building this life with me." Clara turned in his arms to kiss him, a gentle kiss that carried all the love and gratitude and contentment of their shared years. "Thank you for asking," she whispered against his lips. "Thank you for believing that someone like me might want someone like you." "We were both right," Boone said with a smile she could hear in his voice. "We were exactly what each other needed." As they rose to go inside, Clara took one last look at the valley spread out below them, their land, their legacy, their future stretching ahead with all the promise of tomorrow's sunrise. The notice that had brought them together had asked for peaceful company, and they had found so much more than that. They had found a love that was both gentle and strong, a partnership that honored both their individual strengths and their shared dreams, and a happiness built on the solid foundation of mutual respect and unwavering devotion. Inside the warm house, as Clara prepared for bed in the room she now truly shared with her husband, she caught sight of her reflection in the mirror and smiled at what she saw there. Gone was the careful, guarded expression of the woman who had lived above the bakery. In its place was the face of someone who had found her home, her purpose, and her heart's desire. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, as all tomorrows do. But Clara faced the future with perfect confidence, knowing that whatever came, she and Boone would meet it together, as partners in the truest sense of the word. The giant cowboy and his gentle-hearted wife had built something beautiful together, something that would last long after their own story had become legend in the valley they called home. And in the end, that was exactly what love was meant to do: create something larger and more lasting than the sum of its parts. Something that honored both the past and the future, while celebrating the perfect miracle of the present moment. As Clara drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, she whispered a prayer of gratitude for the courage to answer a simple notice, for the wisdom to see past surface appearances, and for the blessing of a love that had exceeded every dream she had ever dared to dream.